Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. We have Pravin and Arthur from our FastTrack team here today, and we're going to be talking about how to handle your customizations within CRM as you look to migrate to the cloud. So, Arthur, you want to take it away?
All right, thanks, Tom. Good morning, everybody. My name is Arthur, and I'll be starting off here and just kind of move my deck here and just make sure things are working. All right, so just to start with the agenda here. So today, as part of our agenda, what we want to have a discussion of is some of the customizations, configurations, and things that you just need to do in order to prepare for your migration to CRM Online using the CRM On-Premise tool. Now, you're probably asking why the webinar, or what is the purpose behind this webinar. What we understand is most of our customers that are probably on this call right now are probably customers that are on a CRM on-premise database, and they're moving to a SaaS model for Dynamics Online. Now, that being said, as we have done most of these migrations, there's all sort of gotchas that we feel like customers need to keep in mind as they move. So this webinar is mostly going to sort of focus on the things that you need, or at least you need to consider in terms of customizations, configurations as you migrate to our platform. Now, the benefits of doing this is what we've really seen in the past is it does reduce the amount of errors that you can possibly run into when you're doing the migration itself. It also speeds up the project turnover times, meaning that you run into less errors, you're not sort of repeating certain things in terms of the migration process itself. So that actually just, and at the end of the day, that holistically just reduces the time that you take, the overall time that you take in your project. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is the performance piece of it as you move to Dynamics Online. What you notice is if you have some of these things already considered in terms of, say, customizations, you will notice that you might actually tend to have a better performance online because you're not running into things such as deprecated code. The last thing that I kind of want to sort of point out is, which is I think is the key takeaway, is obviously the improved user experience and adoption. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can't get that, I think we've all failed, right? So that is really the key piece of this whole webinar. Now, without further ado, what we'll talk about is the configuration, some of the configurations or changes that we've really noticed in the past. As you can see above on that deck, I'm just highlighting, high level of different things that we have, that we've seen in terms of configurations that we think are sort of like your low hanging fruit or things that you really need to tackle on. So as you go through understanding some of these changes, what we suggest typically is for you to sort of measure the complexity level of your configuration and customizations. So to do so, I'll possibly say, determine maybe the impact of these changes, right? What impact these changes have on you. As you understand the impact of these changes, you'll probably be able to also measure the sort of complexity level and things that you need to prioritize as you go through it. So take, for example, the web config file. I think for most of you, it's probably not unheard of that, a lot of customers would sometimes typically make some changes on, say, settings and configurations of their own application on premise using the config file. So what you want to do is make sure you evaluate that no changes have been made. Well, if changes have been made, because maybe there might be changes that have been made with the prior admin before you, but if there are changes that are made, I think then it's ideal to understand what changes are being made and how that impacts your application when those changes are not in play. Because at the end of the day, any changes made in these config files are not going to be ported over by the tool, right? Like those are just going to stay on premise, right? In that same aspect, check for other things such as any database or registry modifications that were made. Say, for example, from sort of previous experiences, you'll see a lot of people adding things such as like SQL timeout values. So understand those things are not getting ported over. So now at least try to understand if somebody made a change in the registry key, try to understand why they made that change and how that can impact your migration at the end of the day. So the other things that I would also suggest considering other than these would be your custom integration jobs. If you have any batch jobs that you typically are running that are stored outside, right, Dynamics. Most of these settings are stored outside Dynamics. So those never get ported over, right? When we pick up the database, we just pick up the CRM DB. So if you have any settings that are just stored out, sitting somewhere else, then what you want to make sure you do is sort of catalog that, right? You want to catalog that list and have at least an idea of, okay, hey, this is what we have. These are the batch jobs that we're running, and make sure you have them all, right? And once you have that, be mindful of the fact that you'll have to update some of these connections and some of these settings. Now, an example is, say, for example, if somebody has, like, say, an SSI package that's moving data from your in-house application to, say, Dynamics on-premise. Now, you want to just kind of have a good understanding of what it's all doing and identify those jobs and list them. The last thing that I want to call out would be things such as like your UCI adoption, right? Have you, sort of take a minute and just, measure out, okay, have you actually adopted UCI, or is that something you intend to adopt, right? If you have adopted it, then that's an automatic good sign, right? But if you haven't, then you need to sort of have a plan in place on how you're going to cross over, right? When you migrate to Dynamics Online. So now that in itself is a whole big topic, right? And what I always suggest is we'll send out a link for the UCI playbook. At least go through that UCI playbook, understand what you need to do, and what you need to consider as part of your journey to Dynamics Online. All right. Just in the effort of explaining a little more further on integrations, I think as you go through this, like, the other things that you want to consider is just making sure you don't only just look at just batch jobs, right? Like, you're looking at even first-party integrations, right? You're looking at all sorts of things such as web API calls. Start cataloging all these integrations and having a good understanding, right, on who the owners are for those integrations, what the volume you expect from those integrations, like the source, the destination for those jobs that you're running, say maybe things like the frequency, right? And, all the fun things that come with it, right? Like, you want to have a holistic idea of all these jobs that are sitting out there and evaluate the amount of work that actually, and be able to actually evaluate the amount of work that actually needs to be done for each integration as you proceed to migrate into Dynamics Online. All right, so the other sort of key things that we see that are almost very important, ISV solutions and unsupported third-party solutions. Now, keep in mind, when you're using on-premise to online migration, the advantage of that, right, is we pick up all your solutions, managed or unmanaged. We can just move them, right, and everything is fine in terms of that. Now, where the issues come into play is when you have solutions that are either unsupported or that need some sort of refactoring, right? Is most customers, I'll say, for most customers that we've worked with, have some sort of an ISV solution or a managed solution that's sitting somewhere in the on-premise deployment. Now, that being said, I would say what you need to start doing is sort of considering understanding the nature of the solutions prior to the upgrade. So keep in mind some of these solutions that a lot of people have, they've been using them for years in like a Dynamics version that's very maybe like 2011, say, for example, like, or they've been using it in an older Dynamics version, essentially. So what this would imply is you would run into solutions that are probably unsupported or code that is unsupported, right, as you move to a later version. So it is a good time to sort of check on all these solutions before migrating. So just to start like reviewing the solutions that you have. After you have a count and say a list of these solutions, determine like, okay, what's the sort of the level of complexity in this in these solutions that you have. Once you understand what you have, sort of what use cases these ISV solutions are being used for, or what issues they fix, or what issues they were put in place to fix, right? Try and determine if they're still even necessary to use in the version of Dynamics that you are landing into. So meaning if you're moving into our latest, well, you'll be moving into our latest Dynamics Online version. Now you want to make sure that, okay, there's not whatever gap you were sort of trying to fix back then with that managed solution or that ISV solution that you got. Is it something that you even still need to fix, or is it something that we have first-party solutions that are almost taking care of that, and features that cater to that in a way you don't actually need to use these solutions. Now, as you go through all this, you might realize, yeah, okay, there are some solutions that your organization clearly needs, and there are some that you don't need anymore. So you get rid of the ones that you don't need anymore, and you essentially focus on the ones that you clearly need. Now, with the ones that you clearly need, you need to obviously determine things such as, do they need to be upgraded to work in a later version, right? Like, are these solutions some things that you need to sort of fix, to get a later version for it that works online? So if it's coming from an ISV, maybe maybe communicate with your ISV, or check on if there's later versions for it, and sort of do the testing with those solutions. Now, if they're managed solutions, you want to also make sure, okay, hey, do you have access to the code? Are these solutions still even, is the code that you have for these managed solutions even still supported in the later versions? If not, then if you have access to it, then you probably want to work on fixing any unsupported or deprecated code and refactoring that back in. If you don't at that point, then you're at the point where if there isn't any deprecated code, you might still be able to move that managed solution. You'll be able to move that managed solution to Dynamics Online version, but you want to make sure that it actually works. You might end up having to just test it, right? Because you don't have the code. Because I've seen some scenarios where some customers need the managed solution. They don't have access to the code. They don't know if it's going to work or not with the new version. So that might be a place where you would need to test it. But I would suggest not. I would suggest if you can find the source code and making sure and evaluating the code and making sure nothing is unsupported or deprecated, that would be the first plan. Then for the database considerations, I'll have Pravin discuss this a little further more here.
Sure. Thanks. So while the database considerations are as important as looking at other customizations that you have on the on-prem org. So most importantly, if you are heavy SSRS report user, then if you do not have any plans to switch over to the Power BI dashboards as part of your migration, then I would say like just take a look at all those custom reports and see if they have been using, or if they were customized in a way that fetch XML code is there in the reports. If you do not happen to have fetch XML, then you must convert those reports to fetch XML based, so that we'll continue to use those SSRS reports. So in the online environment, the direct queries, the SQL direct queries is not allowed. So that's the whole reason behind switching over the reports to fetch XML. And this is very important change. And then not making, so there are two recommendations that we have. If you do not wish to make these changes when you do the test migrations, that's totally fine. For the production migration, you must remove those reports, or you must convert those reports to fetch XML to let the migration complete successfully. On the other hand, you also have these custom tables. So custom tables, what I mean by custom tables is here, the out-of-box tables are totally fine, so you don't have to touch all those tables. But if you happen to create tables directly in the SQL server, if you happen to create any kind of database objects within the SQL server by logging into the SSMS from the backend, those are the tables, so those are the objects that you must address, like you must remove them. So the only objects that must reside in the database is either the one that are introduced through the out-of-the-box or out-of-the-box setup, or the objects that are introduced through your customizations. That's very important change. So we have seen some customers creating views in the backend to generate reports out of those. And if those views are not part of any of your customizations, if they're not introduced through your customizations, it's going to cause the migration to fail. So this is very important change. So just take a look at your custom tables and the custom database objects which are directly created within the database, and you must remediate them as part of this migration. And another important aspect is the database size itself. So the one thing that is going to significantly change here in the online environment is your storage model. So in the on-prem environment, you will have the local disk where you are going to host your database, and the data growth plans have been discussed, and then it has been addressed on the on-prem. But what happens in the online environment is you also have to, you will, it's a recurring cost. The capacity is a recurring cost in the online environment. You must really make sure that your database size is lighter. That not only helps the migration, it will also help to lower your the cost, the storage cost once you migrate online. And there are two things here, so that I must call out. If your database size is almost touching a terabyte or over terabyte, we have other set of steps that we are going to share with you to prep the database for this migration. So if the database size is less than a terabyte, we are totally fine. But that actually calls for the next bullet that we pointed out here, which is regulate size of POA table. It's not just one table. Just take a look at all the tables across your database and see what are those tables that is taking a lot of space. So I can call out POA table as one, async operations base is another one, and plugin log base is another one. Just take a look at those tables and just check with the business on your side to see if you really need to bring in all the data from those tables to the online. So some customers may need it for the compliance reasons. You can definitely plan it. But I would say, like, for most customers, when this data is not really important to be migrated online, I would recommend to take a look at those tables and just clean up the data in the on-prem. For compliance reasons, if you have to retain that, just see if there's any alternate solutions, like you can retain that data in the on-prem while uploading the database to us, which is by removing this the tables which is occupying a lot of space in the database. So that's totally up to you. You have to plan it so that you can your storage cost will be minimized once you migrate online. And your experience will also be good. Like, overall migration experience is going to be significantly different if you bring in the lighter database. And another important change as part of this, the out-of-the-box setup in the on-prem usually comes with Latin 1 General CI/AI as a SQL collation for language code 1033, which is a US English. And this changes. This is different from different languages. So it's really important for us to change the collation of the SQL to match with the org's base language in that region. So so we will work with you as part of this migration to understand your collation setup in the on-prem, and then what is the org's base language that you have, and what is that collation that we need to change, that we need to set to as part of this migration. So this is totally the prerequisite set of prerequisites that we are going to share with you, and we are going to help you change this collation to the required collation as part of the migration. But this is very important change. And as I called out earlier, like, so it's really important for you to look at the custom database objects like tables, and even the custom triggers is another thing. So we have noticed in some customers, there's a requirement on their side to create custom triggers in the on-prem to fulfill the various business needs, which is not really created through Dynamics, through customizations. It's not an out-of-the-box trigger. It's not a trigger that has been introduced through customizations, but it has been created directly in the database. So those are the ones that you should really look at and then clean them up before the migration. Even that SQL stored procedure as well, right? So like the next point, next bullet that is mentioned, it's really important to take a look at the stored procs, whether they have been introduced through the customizations or if they have been created directly in the database. So take a look at those stored procs, those triggers, and see if you really need to keep them or leave them as is within the database, and then take an action if they are not needed. And the SQL, the custom SQL functions is another thing that that must be remediated as part of this migration. So I understand like there's too many changes that we are looking at right now, but once you look at those, once you do these dry runs or the test migrations, so we can definitely tell you if you have missed something, like if probably there is a lingering SQL stored procedure that we couldn't detect as part of cleaning up. But the first test migration is obviously going to catch these things, and then it's going to tell us that, hey, there's a SQL stored procedure that is going to cause the migration to fail. So it's really important to do that exercise and then clean up those unwanted objects and then proceed with the migration. And apart from these things that we just discussed, we also have to look at the product capabilities in terms of what Microsoft has recommended. Like we have attributes per entity, there's a limit on it. So we have 1024 cap as a number, the max number of attributes that can be created per entity. So make sure that your on-prem entities per each attribute is not very close to 1024. So what happens is as part of the migration, so your database is upgraded to the different versions. Like if you're coming from CRM 2013, it will be first upgraded to CRM 2015, 2016, and then online. So right, so as part of this migration from different, like staging from different versions, before we eventually place your org to the online environment, we may reach that cap of 1024, or we may exceed that, which is going to cause a migration to fail. So it's really important to evaluate what is the limit that we have, and then in the online environment, and take that action as part of this prerequisites. Arthur, can you move?
All right, so we'll talk about handling custom code. So as you do most of your migrations, what you tend to see is a lot of, I'm sure a lot of customers already know, they tend to know that, you know, as they go through the environments today, as things stand, they will notice that they have a lot of C# or JavaScript or HTML or any other custom code that they have sitting in the environment that they need to assess. So what I would suggest obviously is acquire a list of all instances that you use in your custom code in, right? So do some sort of review of your environment to just say, okay, you know what, here's what I'm currently using in my environment. Now, as you identify the use of any, say, custom web pages and JavaScript libraries, what you need to do is you want to make sure that you have no unsupported code, you don't have any deprecated methods, and you also want to look at sort of your patterns, right? Your engineering patterns of your code, just to make sure that, hey, from a performance perspective, your current code is going to work well as you migrate to Dynamics Online. So the other thing outside that I would always suggest people do, obviously, is get familiar with Solution Checker. If you haven't really used it, we will send you the link. The reason why this is sort of an important sort of piece is because it does give you a holistic idea of what you all have in your environment, right? It gives you this sort of 360 view and gives you like the programming patterns that you're using, and if it's something that we sort of, you know, tell you to shy away against, or if there's things that we think might cause performance issues, we'll call that out. And if it's unsupported stuff, we will also call that out, or deprecated stuff. Right now, when you've done this, I think as though I mentioned this because sometimes that's an easier way of getting to find out all the instances where you're using some sort of custom code, right, within your Dynamics environment. Now, the other thing I would suggest is obviously with custom code is reviewing the custom plugins that you have. Now, with the custom plugins that you have, once you have a list of these, you want to make sure obviously that there aren't any big flags, right, in terms of the deprecation of code or things that need to be changed. But the main things that we normally know that actually stop the migrations are things such as, you know, identifying non-sandbox plugins, meaning if you do have non-sandbox plugins, you want to know that you want to know exactly why these plugins are non-sandbox as a sort of the first stepping point. So at least if you can determine why they're non-sandbox, right? Like say maybe you identify that, okay, the reason why is because somebody is making some call to the registry or, you know, file location, then at least you can actually determine what needs to happen with that plugin before you switch it to a sandbox plugin. The key takeaway obviously is we all understand that in Dynamics Online, we will not let plugins run in a non-sandbox state. So that is always key to do to review. The other thing I would also call out that causes issues after post the migration, during the migration, would be plugins that are set to trigger on the system user base table. So what I would just do is typically just go into Dynamics and query all your assemblies that are either set to trigger on all entities or set to trigger on the system user base table itself. Now, once you find those, you want to make sure, okay, at least when you do the migration, those plugins are disabled and they are not running immediately as you proceed to doing the migration. So this is not to say that you can't run plugins on it. You just want to make sure during the migration process, those plugins are disabled and are not currently in use. The final thing I would say is, as you go through some of the sort of your JavaScript and as you go through some of your as you go through some of your code, you want to identify, you know, from a JavaScript level, certain things you want to know that, like, as you migrate, there are things that we can go through the migration process from a JavaScript perspective. We can do a bunch of things where you can end up with the final same JavaScript, same source code in Dynamics Online, but we wouldn't ourselves update it, right? We wouldn't go through the upgrade process of that code. So it's always good to keep in mind that the migration can complete. Now, while it does complete, we won't do anything as far as updating your deprecated code. We would just move your JavaScript as is. So that's why it's sort of key to call out to say, hey, look, if you have anything that is really unsupported, the migration tool is not going to identify it for us as you migrate. It'll just bring that same unsupported code into a later version. And once you're there, you might start noticing that you get JavaScript errors or random errors that really impact your user experience. Or you might see that you sort of end up having performance issues that do impact your users. That being said, I will let Thomas go on from here.
Thanks, Arthur. So how to get started here. If you haven't already, I would really highly recommend that you join our migration community. The link is in the upper right. You know, that community, we really bring together all of our migration resources, from FastTrack to webinars like this to the sort of MVP SME interview series that we're doing, and trying to really bring all of that in one place, along with forums and our other content and resources so that you have one centralized place to answer your migration questions and learn more about the process for your organization and really just get help right from us, from the Microsoft side, as well as, your learn about experiences of other customers that are going through this similar process. And then secondly, there are a lot of great, as Arthur and Pravin were mentioning, there's a lot of great FastTrack resources. Some of those links are here, and we can share those out with folks after the fact. And so I think with that, we'll really move to sort of Q&A a bit. Arthur, if you want to advance the slide, I'm not in control here. But I see that we've sort of addressed some of the more specific individual questions, and we'll be following up with a couple other people just offline. But there are a couple questions here that I thought might be good to sort of just ask the group while we have folks, in terms of the first one being sort of Arthur and Pravin, where would you recommend that an organization start? You provided a lot of information about, here are the considerations, but where would you, of these, how would you prioritize them for an organization? Or is it unique to each organization?
That's a good question. I would, this is always going to be different, but I always measure things based off impact, and I think doing that. I know there's also the migration assessment that always is a good place to start, but definitely evaluate impact and be able to at least sort of determine, hey, okay, are these things going to have higher impact? But even before that, like some of the things that I would almost mention as having higher impact would be obviously the things that block your migrations. And we do have a white paper. We do have a white paper that actually determines what actually the things that are sort of going to gate you from going from point A to point B, right? Like your migration won't work, period, right? So I would obviously start with that, making sure you review those resources from our white paper and our technical talk, where we discuss some of the requirements, the strong requirements. Now you have to understand that those are the strong requirements. So that's obviously a breaker for a lot of people. And then the rest would be really based off doing a pure assessment on severity and the impact of that on your organization.
Anything to add there, Pravin?
Yes, I agree with Arthur on that one. So the white paper is the go-to location, so where you can get started with. The prerequisites that's called out there is pretty much what you should start with. Obviously, you need to consider all those requirements that Arthur has called out as part of the customization related requirements. But yeah, so the migration assessment and the white paper, I believe, are the two important things that you should use to get started.
Okay, and then what would you say are some of the common mistakes that an organization can make with customizations that really impact or could impact their migration?
So the common mistakes that I've seen is on the database side primarily. So especially the database size and then the storage capacity on the customer's tenant, D365 tenant, is not sufficient enough to actually fit this database that we are trying to migrate. So for instance, like some of the customers, they'll just subscribe for 50 gigs of storage, but the database size that they're trying to upgrade is like over 100 gigs. So that's something that we need to do as a math, do the basic math around how much storage you have under your tenant and how many databases you're trying to migrate, be it like sandbox and the production environments that you're trying to migrate. So that's one of the fundamental thing that we need to look at. And the other thing that I would say is missing the prerequisites. So we have like 16 prerequisites that we call out. I think a little over 16 prerequisites that we call out in the white paper. So most of the times that we see that these prerequisites are missed, that is going to lead to this migration to fail. So I would say, like, just pay close attention to the prerequisites and pay close attention to the storage that you have subscribed for and the number of databases that you're trying to migrate. That's important step that we need to take care before we start the migration.
Anything to add there, Arthur?
Yeah, I would say outside that, I think, one of the things that I've really noticed is once a lot of customers migrate to online, or when the migration works, there are things that they sort of tend to sort of drop down on their list. So like in terms of like really evaluating their code, right, that they had, their code base that they had prior on premise, right, making sure you don't actually have a lot of unsupported stuff, right, because a lot of customers sometimes tend to sort of shortcut that, right, because they go, you know what, if I can migrate this database over, that's just fine. But really what ends up happening is now you start facing a lot of sort of quote unquote like this post experience where you're not getting the best usability because you moved in a bunch of things that you could have actually really personally gated before you got there, right? So I would really say focus on that. Also, as you do these migrations, I mean, doing a good work on like non-functional and functional testing, like, your performance testing, making sure that you actually, crossing your T's and dotting your I's, like making sure that you really looking at this as not as just a lift and shift, but as a holistic thing where you also keeping in mind the user experience at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think I would like to add one more point here is like, so what we are essentially doing here is we are picking up an on-prem database and we are converting that into a SaaS solution. So it's a complicated step that we are taking behind the scenes. So it's really important for us to keep everything the prerequisites and things like that must be checked before we start this migration journey. So this is this converting an on-prem database to SaaS sounds very simple on the slide deck like this, but there are a lot of heavy lifting that's happening behind the scenes.
That makes complete sense, Pravin. I see that you answered something in the chat here, but I thought it might be good to sort of address it for everyone, right? So the question is, just so everyone knows, is once migration to the sandbox is complete and the environment is promoted to production, can folks expect sort of a performance upgrade as a result? Do you want to expand on sort of your answer and that a little bit?
Yeah. So for the production, when you compare the sandbox environments with the production environments, the production environments will have a higher compute allocated to them. So the performance is obviously is expected to go up when compared to the sandbox environments. So if you're doing a perf testing on your sandbox, I would say like switch over to the production and then do the perf testing on it before you determine whether how the performance is going to be. Don't go by the performance results on the sandbox environment. I would say like switch over to the production and then test it, and then that's your baseline, right?
Yeah, that's great. So I see we've sort of answered all of the questions in the chat that were specific to individual organizations. Any final thoughts for folks before we sign off here?
Yeah, so I would say like the assessment that you are going to assessment on the on-prem database that we are going to perform is going to really help customers to find out the changes that they must perform before embarking upon this migration journey. And we also have a 24/7 team that is going to really help you with your migrations pretty much any time that you request. So you are backed up by a strong team, and then the direct access to the product feature devs. That's going to help us with this. If we run into any sort of failures, right? So like we have teams that we can rely upon. So this is a most reliable way that customers, like the previous customers that we migrated, definitely mentioned that this is the most reliable migration that they've ever seen with a strong team. that we have. So feel free to give a try. Bring in your on-prem org and then just get it migrated and see how your experience is going to be. And then we are definitely, like, if you have any specific questions, just feel free to send us an email so that we can get into a call and we can discuss and try to address all your questions or concerns that you may have before you start this migration.
That's great. Anything from your side, Arthur? Anything to add before we?
Oh, I think Pravin almost nailed all of it there.
As he does, as he always does.
Yeah, no, I think anything outside that I would probably be reiterating. But yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. I know there's some of our experiences with different migrations. Sometimes sometimes we're really answering something that we've already seen before. So if you're feeling stuck out there and you think there are things that you need to address and you don't understand if the migration process is going to help, definitely reach out to us.
Great. So thanks so much for joining us today. We will be posting this recording to the community and we'll be sending it out after the fact. So thanks again. Look forward to seeing you at a future event.